That's exactly what we heard, right? This is the account that has been repeated as gospel in hundreds of Elvis documentaries, biographies, and movies. The Cinderella story of a young, innocent girl tapped by fate to meet Elvis Presley. It is such a seemingly trivial point that Priscilla is trying so hard to force and just treat as gospel. It's like this hill that she's going to die on. And when you're just going to die on your hill of your narrative, when all this is flying in the face of that, it's just very, very sad. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jennifer. I'm so happy to have you back. We are on part 2 of Child Bride. We're now on chapter 8, and this one is called The Myth Unravels. Now, for chapters 6 and 7, we went into Priscilla's early adolescence, the time period before she arrived in Wiesbaden, Germany, and met Elvis Presley in 1959. And those two chapters are really important to listen to. If you haven't, go ahead and go to the playlist that I've linked in the description. And those chapters are important because they really set us up to Priscilla's psyche, what she was experiencing, the trauma in her early adolescence when she found out about the identity of her birth father. That information had been kept from her for over a decade by her mother, Anne Beaulieu, and her stepfather, Paul Beaulieu. And those two chapters talk about her life before, her confusion about her place and where she fit in with her family, and how her intuition was always correct because she did find out that the identity of her birth father was concealed from her, and her personality, her psyche, the way she viewed the world changed drastically after that discovery. And it sets us up for everything that we will see in Priscilla's life moving forward, because it sets us up into the mind of this beautiful young woman who at the age of 14 meets this international superstar, rock star, world phenomenon, Elvis Presley. Now, part 2 gets into a chapter that is a huge source of contention for a lot of Elvis fans who don't really like or agree with Pricilla Presley's narrative that she has been pushing for about 5 decades now about what she thought of Elvis before she met him, how she met him, the circumstances surrounding their meeting, and the nature of their relationship in Germany. This is the chapter where everything starts falling into place, or rather starts being questioned by the different sources surrounding Priscilla. Now, Suzanne Finstad, the author of Child Bride, interviewed about 300 people who knew Priscilla throughout her entire life for this book. And the way that Priscilla has been telling the story about how she met Elvis Presley, Priscilla wrote about it in her autobiography that was published in 1985 called Elvis and Me. Suzanne Finstad's account of how she met Elvis blows Priscilla's account out of the water. The alleged scandalous nature of the relationship between Pricilla Presley and a man named Currie Grant. And Currie Grant is the man that everyone who knows Elvis and Priscilla lore knows is the man that introduced Priscilla to Elvis. His name was Currie Grant, and he worked in a club called the Eagles Club for American servicemen and their families in Wiesbaden, Germany. And he's the one that first saw Priscilla and asked her if she wanted to meet Elvis. But the story is a lot more deep than that. There are a lot of things to unpack with that story. And it's alarming in the sense that Currie Grant was a grown man who used a child. And you'll understand more as we get into this story. I think it's very important for us to go back to Priscilla's account, her own account of events. Now, in chapters 6 and 7, we find out about the devastating effect that finding out who her real birth father was had on Pricilla Presley. And Suzanne Finstad takes great pain to talk about that extensively and in excruciating detail. And I find it very interesting that in Priscilla's own narrative, in her autobiography, 1985's Elvis and Me, she only assigns a very few carefully worded choice paragraphs to that childhood trauma in her account. And I want to read it to you. And the reason that I'm going to read this to you is because I find that what Suzanne Finstad gives such careful, and I mean, she does it in a very thoughtful and careful manner. What Suzanne does in unraveling and unpacking what happened to Priscilla in Child Bride, it seems like Priscilla herself just really, really is almost standoffish with the story. And having read Child Bride and then going back and rereading what Pricilla wrote in Elvis and Me, it seems very stilted, it seems very standoffish, and it seems like Priscilla is trying to hold this story and her account at arm's length from us, which is well within her rights to do so. But by the same token, if you are going to write an account of your life, people have wondered over the decades, knowing what we know now in, all these accounts that Suzanne found out by interviewing extensively people that knew Priscilla, why Priscilla was so tight-lipped about a lot of things. So this is how Priscilla herself relays the account of finding out about the identity of her birth father. So Priscilla is writing about this in her book, Elvis and Me. And she says, while rummaging through the family keepsakes, I came upon a small wooden box. Inside was a carefully folded American flag, the kind that I knew was given to servicemen's widows. Also inside the box was a picture of my mother with her arm around a strange man and sitting on her lap, an infant. On the back of the photo was inscribed, Mommy, Daddy, Priscilla. I had discovered a family secret. Feeling betrayed, I ran to phone my mother, who was at a party nearby. Within minutes, I was in her arms, crying as she calmed me and explained that when I was 6 months old, my real father, Lieutenant James Wagner, a handsome Navy pilot, had been killed in a plane crash while returning home on leave. 2.5 years later, she married Paul Beaulieu, who adopted me and had always loved me as his own. Mother suggested I keep my discovery from the other children. She felt it would endanger our family closeness, though when it did become known, it had no effect on our feelings for one another. She gave me a gold locket that my father had given her. I cherished that locket and wore it for years and fantasized that my father died a great hero. In times of emotional pain and loneliness, he would become my guardian angel. Now, if you listen to chapter 6 and 7, you would know Suzanne goes into a lot of detail about how this discovery traumatized and tormented Priscilla for years, and her friends, her junior high school friends at the time, talk about a marked difference in the way that Priscilla behaved and conducted herself before this and after this. And no one knew why. They obviously didn't know about what was going on within the dynamics of Priscilla's family. Pricilla relays her experience to Suzanne Finstad in her writing because, as I mentioned before, Suzanne did interview Priscilla for Child Bride, and Priscilla, in the beginning of Suzanne writing this book, Priscilla was cooperating with Suzanne. Once I think Priscilla discovered the tone that the book was taking and what Suzanne was uncovering, she withdrew her consent for the book and decided to not cooperate any further with Suzanne, although she never did sue Suzanne, the author, nor the publisher of Child Bride. So I think that is very, very telling. Although, I've read the entire book and I don't feel that Suzanne participates in any type of character assassination of Priscilla. In all actuality, I feel that Suzanne tries to offer up a more thoughtful and intimate and truthful portrait of Priscilla and what really happened to her throughout her life. And she does not offer up as carefully guarded a narrative as Priscilla does and as we see. Again, Priscilla just regulates this entire traumatic event of her childhood to a couple paragraphs in Elvis and Me, whereas in Child Bride, this was something that really, really affected her. And Priscilla really goes into a lot more detail in her interviews with Suzanne in Child Bride and talks about the devastating effects. So if you want to hear more about that, definitely watch episodes 6 and 7. But I just wanted to point that out to you. And there's another thing that I wanted to read to you before I start chapter 8. And this is Priscilla's account of how she met the man, Currie Grant, who eventually introduced her to Elvis Presley. Okay? So this is what Priscilla tells us about that. I'm reading Elvis and Me again from my Kindle version here. So Priscilla says about having to move to Wiesbaden, Germany. She was crushed. Germany was on the other side of the world. She didn't want to go. And then she says, September came, and with it, school. Once again, I was the new girl. I was no longer popular and secure as I had been at Del, and Del Val was her junior high school in Texas. There was a place called the Eagles Club, where American service families went for dinner and entertainment, and soon proved an important discovery for me. Every day after school, I'd go to the snack bar there and listen to the jukebox and write letters to my friends back home in Austin. Drowning in tears, one warm summer afternoon, I was sitting with my brother Don when I noticed a handsome man in his 20s staring at me. I'd seen him watching me before, but I never paid any attention to him. This time, he stood up and walked toward me. He introduced himself as Currie Grant and asked my name. Pricilla Presley, I said, immediately suspicious. He was much older than I. He asked where in the States I was from, how I liked Germany, and if I liked Elvis Presley. Of course, I said, laughing, who doesn't? I'm a good friend of his. My wife and I go to his house quite often. Would you like to join us one evening? Unprepared for such an extraordinary invitation, I grew even more skeptical and guarded. I told him I'd have to ask my parents. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, Currie met my parents and my father checked out his credentials. Currie was also in the Air Force, and it turned out that my father knew his commanding officer. Currie assured Dad that I'd be well chaperoned when we visited Elvis, who lived off base in a house in Bad Nauheim. I'm going to leave it there. So what do we know according to Priscilla's account? She's in the Eagle Club. She notices a handsome man who was much older in his 20s staring at her. She had noticed him before, so that would lead us to believe that she had seen him but never spoken to him. And obviously, according to Pricilla, that would be the case because he goes up to her, introduces himself as Currie Grant, asking her where she's from, what her name is, if she likes Germany, and does she like Elvis Presley? Is she a fan of his? And so that's what we know. And then we also know that she was unprepared for such an extraordinary invitation, that this was something completely out of the blue, and that her parents were skeptical, okay? And she also says again, over the course of the next 2 weeks, Currie met my parents and my father checked out his credentials, and Currie was assuring Priscilla's stepfather, Paul Beaulieu, that she would be well chaperoned when she visited Elvis in a house off base. So that is what we know according to the account of Pricilla in her book, Elvis and Me. So I just felt it was very, very important to insert that into the video so that you would know from Priscilla's own account, her version of the event, how she met the man that introduced her to Elvis Presley, a man named Currie Grant. Okay, so now let's get into chapter 8 of Child Bride, and this one is called The Myth Unravels. And I wanted to point out to you guys that I'm wearing my Elvis Presley sweatshirt. Okay, chapter 8, The Myth Unravels. When Priscilla arrived in Germany in the middle of August, she was a lost kid, missing my friends. School had not begun yet, so Priscilla knew no one. I don't think she was really happy in Germany at first, recalled Christine Laws, who read Priscilla's letters to her friends back in Austin. Anne Beaulieu had given birth to her fourth child, Jeff, a few months before the family left Texas, giving Priscilla 3 younger siblings under the age of 10 to babysit. Oh my gosh, can you believe that? Giving birth and then moving your entire family across an ocean to Germany? I mean, my kids were, just turned 12 when we moved last year to Germany, and I was pulling my hair out. I had, the twins, the cat, my mom, everybody. I was like, crazy. But anywho. So she's got 3 younger siblings, all under the age of 10. And Priscilla is the oldest. She's the oldest, and she's also the love child of Anne, her mother, and James Wagner, who was her real birth father, died when she was a baby. Her mother was married before. You find all about that in chapters 6 and 7. Okay. She was a teenager who was physically isolated from her peers and alone in a foreign country. Fate, however, had not forgotten Priscilla. The Eagle Club, a community center for American military personnel in Wiesbaden. The club had been converted from a majestic pre-World War II mansion modeled after the White House. On Saturday nights, a live variety show called Hit Parade featuring entertainment acts from around Europe. Priscilla quickly discovered the Eagle Club, and, as was the custom of her 14 years, she did not go unnoticed. One late summer afternoon, possibly her first at the club, Pricilla strode through the castle-like entrance on Paulinastrasse, perhaps with her younger brother Donnie. The precise time, 5:30 p.m., was noted and engraved upon the brain of the attractive 20-something man who spotted her, just as he would recall in minute detail each of his subsequent encounters with Pricilla Beaulieu. His name was Currie Grant, and he was a Louisiana-born and bred airman first class who moonlighted evenings and weekends as assistant manager of the Eagle Club. So this is someone who knows all the ins and outs of what's going on in his club. And as we will see, when Pricilla strode into the front door of the club, he took immediate notice of her. He was also something of a local celebrity as the host of the hit parade on Saturday nights. Although he was married with 2 small girls, Currie Grant was a notorious ladies' man. On this late summer afternoon, his radar zeroed in on Pricilla Beaulieu. I was sitting in the foyer talking to Petty Dotson, the director of the club. As she was walking up these steps, I looked up from talking to Peggy, and I saw Pricilla. Her Dresden doll face and daintiness drew Currie like a magnet. He was also impressed by Priscilla's immaculate grooming. She was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. She carried herself like a princess, and that's the God's truth. That is Currie's direct quote to the author, Suzanne. Pricilla Beaulieu could not have captured the attention of a more fortuitous person in Wiesbaden, for Currie Grant was a friend and occasional guest at the Bad Nauheim residence of Elvis Presley. Peggy was in mid-sentence. I jumped up and left her sitting there and went straight to Priscilla, threw out my hand and said, "Hi, my name's Currie Grant, and I'm the manager of the club. Is there anything I can do for you?" Priscilla, according to Currie, was reticent. In hot pursuit, he began questioning her, learning her name, that her family had just moved from Texas. After 10 minutes of strained dialogue, mostly one-sided, Currie invited Priscilla to attend the hit parade and told her he was around most evenings if she needed anything, and rejoined his boss. When she walked away, I kind of watched her, and grown men, 2 of them, stopped and watched her as she went past. That tells you a million things right there. They couldn't keep their eyes off her. From then on, I felt the same way. Now, he doesn't say if he knows how old she was at this point. Priscilla was 14 years old, and he hasn't said if he knew how old she was at that point. In reality, Currie Grant fell for Priscilla before Elvis Presley did. That was not surprising, for both men had the same taste in women, petite, extremely young brunettes. Their high sex drives were also similar. They even shared the same birthday, January 8th, though Currie at 28 was 3 years older than Elvis. Now, I want to say something in here where the author says that Currie and Elvis had same sex drives, high sex drives. Now, obviously that would be something that Currie would relate to the author. I don't know how Currie professes to have or know this information, but this is just coming from Currie, okay? This isn't something that is 100% bulletproof. Obviously, this is Currie's account and his recollection of Elvis. I'm not saying it's true. We don't know. Currie Grant was not just attracted to Pricilla Beaulieu, he was mesmerized by her. Over the next week or so, Priscilla visited the Eagle Club several more times. Currie tried to strike up a further conversation, but every time I tried to stop her, she gave me a really sweet little smile, either looked down or looked forward and just kept on walking. And I let it go at that. His ego was bruised. He was entranced by Pricilla Beaulieu, and her cool ice princess mind aroused him further. I was interested in her, period. Currie was not certain of her age, which added to Priscilla's sexual mystique. She looked very young, he recalled, but dressed like an older girl. Priscilla started the 9th grade, her first year of high school, within days of meeting Currie Grant. Her arrival at H.H. Arnold caused a minor frisson. "Oh, darling," recalled Mary Ann Barks, a classmate. Everyone had been talking about, "Oh, gosh, you gotta see the new girl." Priscilla had created a new look for herself upon arriving in Germany. She began wearing her hair in an unusual style, short and curly about the face and long in the back, with tendrils she would sometimes bring to one side or in a ponytail. To anyone who had seen Love Me Tender, the look was familiar. It was a replica of Deborah Paget's hairstyle in the movie, the look that Elvis Presley fell in love with. Anne Beaulieu, who had seen Love Me Tender at the Majestic in Austin, used to help with Priscilla's hair and makeup in Wiesbaden. Priscilla's beauty habits even caught the eye of the faculty. Paul Bungiger, one of the native German instructors, still remembers her makeup 35 years later. She had special lipstick on, a bit of dark red, and with a purple touch. Now, this is a male German teacher. That's kind of descriptive to remember that the lipstick had a purple hue tone to it. That's actually pretty clear detail how many years later. It says 35 years later in this book because this book was written in 1997, FYI. At H.H. Arnold, Priscilla quickly fell into the pattern of her troubled 8th grade year at DeVal, making poor grades and attaching herself to older guys. Linda Williams, Priscilla's friend from Austin, moved to Wiesbaden that same year and immediately tried out for the cheerleading squad, but Priscilla gravitated toward the black leather jacket clique, most of whom were members of the Teen Auto Club. She had no close friends and did not seek to rekindle her acquaintance with Linda. Priscilla's estrangement was more emotional than physical. She wore the locket concealing her real father's picture less and less often, feeling that she was betraying Paul Beaulieu. Priscilla was a confused teenager. She was ripe for an escape, ready for her fantasy of Elvis. As if on cue, Currie Grant emerged in her quest to meet her idol. How that happened is the source of a bitter dispute between Currie and Priscilla. Currie claims that Priscilla approached him seeking entree to Elvis Presley after walking past him at the Eagle Club 3 or 4 times. His recollection of the day is vivid. I got to the Eagle Club about 5 o'clock and I was hungry. I went in the snack bar, got a hamburger, and went way back to the last table so no one would bother me. And there's Priscilla. She came directly to the table and stood there and said, "Hi." And I said, "Hello." First words out of her mouth, "I understand you know Elvis." At that split second, it was such a letdown. My ego just went straight to the floor. And I said, "I sure do." She says, "Well, I sure would like to meet him." Her exact words. My exact words were, "Well, so would a lot of other girls, but sit down and we'll talk about it." Now, this is where Priscilla's account comes into play and why I took the pains earlier in this episode to read to you exactly what Priscilla wrote about how Currie and her met and how it came about that he took her to go meet Elvis, because I wanted to be fair and I wanted to introduce Priscilla's version of events in the video. So Suzanne, the author, tells us, Priscilla's version, as set forth in her 1985 autobiography, is that a stranger, Currie Grant, came up to her and her little brother, Donnie, at the Eagle Club when she first arrived in Germany, introduced himself, told her he was a friend of Elvis Presley's, and invited her to accompany him and his wife to Elvis's house. That's exactly what we heard, right? This is the account that has been repeated as gospel in hundreds of Elvis documentaries, biographies, and movies. The Cinderella story of a young, innocent girl tapped by fate to meet Elvis Presley. But is it true, or is it a romantic fairy tale concocted by Priscilla? Priscilla has her parents to support her version, and Currie has his former wife, Carol, to support his, but they were not present. The only other witness, according to Priscilla, was her brother Don, and he was a child. Ever since he met Priscilla Beaulieu, Currie Grant has offered the same account of how she approached him and asked to meet Elvis. When she married Elvis Presley in 1967, Currie began to compile materials for a biography to be called Elvis and Priscilla, but the project was delayed several times and later put aside. When Priscilla published her own memoir in 1985, Currie says, "Well, that's her story. I'll tell mine when my book comes out, and mine was going to be the truth." Currie's reaction was similar to Pam Rutherford's when she read Priscilla's autobiography and saw that Priscilla had reversed the story about the Carnival Queen contest, and that was back in chapter 5. "But people now are taking it for the Bible," Currie said of Priscilla's version of how she met Elvis, "and they're quoting lies. They don't bother to dig into things. They just pick up the book and think this is the way it happened, the way she's telling it." While Currie has related the same account for nearly 40 years, Priscilla's story is inconsistent from telling to telling. Recently, in October of 1995, she claimed that Currie introduced himself to her and her brother as Johnny Appleseed, which conflicts with her own book. At times, she contradicts herself in the same conversation. In her October 1995 version, she repeated her contention that Currie Grant was a stranger when he approached her with the invitation to meet Elvis Presley. I never even knew this man. I never knew Currie Grant. Never saw him before. Then she contradicted herself, saying she actually saw him a couple of times staring at me. So as we can see, the inconsistencies in Priscilla's story regarding Currie Grant and her meeting this man, Currie, are starting to become more and more apparent. She's contradicting herself in the same conversation, apparently with the author Suzanne, saying, she'd never seen him before in her life. But then in her own account, in her book, Elvis and Me, she's saying that she did notice him staring at her. She just never paid him any mind. Petty Dotson, the manager of the Eagle Club, with whom Currie claimed to be in conversation when Priscilla walked in, remembered the encounter exactly as Currie related it. We were both there in that round lobby, and she came in and I said, "Gosh, that sure is a pretty girl." And Currie said, "I'm going to go check that out." And he went over and talked to her. And then about an hour later, we saw each other again. And Currie told me that she had just moved here and her father was a captain, I believe. Peggy Dotson's confirmation of this exchange proves that Currie did not approach Priscilla as a stranger and invite her to meet Elvis the first time he spoke to her. Peggy Dotson's memory also verifies that Priscilla had to have known who Currie was when they had their eventual conversation about Elvis, whoever instigated it. Now, I talked about in a previous episode about how even tiny little seemingly insignificant nuanced details Priscilla seems meticulous about, but also they change, just like her ever-evolving account of how exactly she encountered and met Currie. So this is going to get really, really crazy, you guys. Okay, are you ready for this? Okay. It says, after 30 years estrangement, Currie Grant and Pricilla Presley agreed to meet in my home in May of 1996 to discuss their conflicting accounts of how she met Elvis Presley. Priscilla offered the Johnny Appleseed version of Currie's invitation to meet Elvis the first time he approached her at the Eagle Club. Currie repeated his usual unwavering story, that he spotted Priscilla in the foyer and chatted, that he tried to engage her in conversation several times afterward, and that she later approached him in the snack bar asking to meet Elvis. Now, the following exchange is direct dialogue quoted by the author Suzanne of Currie and Priscilla. So this is them going back and forth. Okay, Priscilla, but you asked me, would you like to meet Elvis? Currie, well, that's the contention here. Priscilla, you said, would you like to meet Elvis? Currie, Priscilla, I'm not going to argue about it. I know what happened, and I'm sure you think you know what happened, okay? It didn't happen that way, in my opinion. Priscilla, okay, that's your opinion. The exchange later grew more heated. Currie, I'm going to tell you my version of it, which is the only true version that I know of. I've lived with it all these years, Priscilla. Priscilla, so have I. I remember it very distinctly. Priscilla, that's what happened, Currie. Currie, that's not what happened. I had my story, which is the true version. Anyway, it's nothing to get upset about. It's just that your version and my version do not match. And they haven't matched for years, so that's okay. As the debate continued, Priscilla modified several key details of her story. She admitted that she had seen Currie around the Eagle Club before he invited her to meet Elvis. She vaguely recalled Currie interrupting a conversation with Peggy Dotson to introduce himself. And she changed her sequence, suddenly declaring that now she was not saying it happened the first time he spoke to her. By her own admission in May of 1996, Priscilla's fairy tale account of a complete stranger walking up to her to ask if she would like to meet Elvis Presley was untrue. Since Pricilla admittedly knew or knew of Currie before they discussed meeting Elvis, it was conceivable she had learned that he was a friend of Elvis Presley's. Thus, she could have asked Currie to introduce her to Elvis, indicating that she knew more about Currie than she had previously let on. Accepting Priscilla's word about the key element, who asked whom to meet Elvis, becomes problematic. This is what I'm talking about when I'm saying just stick to the facts, just stick to what happened. But when you are trying to weave your particular narrative, if indeed Priscilla's version is just this yarn that she's spinning, it becomes problematic when you are meeting up with other people's accounts of what happened. And this is the entanglement now that Pricilla is finding herself in with Currie, in the author Suzanne's home, basically as they're going at it regarding, how did this happen? How did this really go down? And you would think it's a tiny little thing that doesn't have to be that big of a deal. But if it is indeed true that Pricilla fabricated and made up her own fairy tale version about how this happened, if she did indeed do that, that's why she's now running into so many problems 35 years later. It's very interesting. So the author goes on and says, during her May 1996 confrontation with Currie, Pricilla offered yet another version of how he invited her to meet Elvis. This time, she suggested that she and Currie were talking at the club and that Currie introduced her to a young Elvis impersonator named Peter von Weckmar. That's how it all came about, that Currie knew Elvis, she declared. And he came to me and said, I know him. Would you like to meet him? My wife and I go there, and I remember that very vividly. This is Pricilla saying this now. Do you see what I mean? What a tangle web we weave. Whoever's weaving it, be it Pricilla or Currie, I believe it's interesting, however, and the author takes pains to remind us that Currie's version has remained the same, has remained consistent over at that time, almost 4 decades, whereas Priscilla's account keeps changing. So the author is saying about Pricilla, she also challenged Currie's scenario by arguing that it was so unlike her, so unlike what she would do, to boldly walk up to someone, say she understood that he knew Elvis, and state that she would like to meet him. So this is now more dialogue between Pricilla and Currie. Pricilla, so if I'm this shy girl that you say I was, how would I ever get the guts to come to you? That's not even my nature. Currie, you came in that snack bar like a rocket. Pricilla, never. Currie, came straight to that table, man. Pricilla, people who know me know that's not the way I am. I was so shy at 14. Currie, you were shy when I met you. Yes, that's absolutely true. Pricilla, it's so uncharacteristic of me. Was it? It was virtually the same modus operandi that Pricilla had employed at age 11 when she strode up to a startled Drew Foradori, told him he looked like Elvis, and asked him on a date. This dual aspect of Priscilla's personality would be recognizable to her classmates in Germany as well. Their closer male friends remembered a ballsy girl. Priscilla's male friends in Texas, Drew, Henry, and Mike, remembered her as aggressive when she had a goal. When she wanted something, she went after it, to quote one boy. In the summer of 1959, she was going all out to meet Elvis Presley. Priscilla's second defense in her face-to-face encounter with Currie that day was that she wasn't even a fan of Elvis Presley's when she met Currie. Therefore, she would not have requested to meet him. So this is Currie. You're talking about Elvis Presley, the most famous entertainer in the world. Pricilla, but I wasn't, wait a second, Currie, but I wasn't that, Currie. Elvis Presley wasn't the item for me. Currie, that's not what you told me. I have all his records. I've seen all his movies. Pricilla, I may have said I've seen his movies. I may very well have said that. I did not have all his records. My father got me one record, one album. Pricilla had not counted on the memories of her Austin acquaintances, the ghosts from her past, neighbor at DeVal who heard her playing Elvis Presley records nonstop from the 5th grade on, and most importantly, her one-time best friend, Pam Rutherford, with whom she played Imagine If for 2 solid years, pretending that she was dating or married to Elvis Presley. Priscilla was caught in a web of untruths and kept entangling herself further, insisting during the confrontation with Currie that she didn't even know Elvis was in Germany. She didn't even know the area, though in her own book, she wrote that she looked up Bad Nauheim and Wiesbaden on the map. She insisted, to refute Currie, "I wasn't infatuated with meeting Elvis Presley, you know?" Priscilla had obviously forgotten, if she ever knew, that her cousin Margaret Ann Iverson had given a brief but telling interview to the New London, Connecticut newspaper in March of 1960. Margaret Ann recounted for cousin Priscilla's 2-week stopover in Connecticut the previous summer and how, as she was leaving for Germany, Priscilla had said to her that she would like to meet Elvis. But there was more. Priscilla's final defense was that she couldn't have asked Currie for an introduction to Elvis Presley because she didn't even know he knew Elvis. It was common knowledge at the Eagle Club, and he assumed she either picked it up here or heard it from one of her friends. Priscilla hotly disputed this. A half-American classmate of Priscilla's from Wiesbaden, Vera von Kronthal. Vera's best friend was a stunning German girl of 15 named Steffi McCann. According to Vera, Priscilla was standing in line behind her and Steffi in the Eagle Club snack bar one day and mentioned to Steffi that she would like to meet Elvis Presley. She asked to see Elvis. She was interested, and she was trying to get in there. Priscilla knew that Steffi was a friend of Currie's and that Currie knew Elvis. "I remember Steffi complaining about Priscilla," Vera insisted. "Oh, she's always bugging me. I'll get her to meet Elvis and get her off my back." Just something like that. It is not impossible to imagine that Currie Grant might have dangled an invitation to meet Elvis as a lure to Priscilla. His story, however, stands up to scrutiny. Priscilla's does not. Priscilla and Currie clearly met and got acquainted in the foyer of the Eagle Club with no mention of Elvis Presley, just as Currie maintained. His boss, Peggy Dotson, confirmed this, and Priscilla eventually admitted it. And there is every reason to believe that Priscilla then approached Currie in the snack bar of the Eagle Club, hoping for an introduction to Elvis. And Vera von Kronthal provided the missing link by confirming that Priscilla knew that Currie was a friend of Elvis's. Why was Priscilla so desperate to establish such a seemingly trivial point? Who asked whom to meet Elvis? And why would she deny that she was an Elvis fan who was determined to meet him? It involved more secrets harbored by the girl who was reared on hidden truths. So that is the end of chapter 8. The next one is chapter 9, called A Faustian Bargain. But again, 100% I agree with the author. It is such a seemingly trivial point that Priscilla is trying so hard to force and just treat as gospel. It's like this hill that she's going to die on. But it is very, very important to Priscilla to maintain to all of us that she really wasn't an Elvis fan and that she was approached by a stranger in this mythical kind of fantasy way, who asked her, "Do you want to meet Elvis?" And I think as the story unfolds more, you'll see possibly what the motive was, why she felt she had to do that. In her retelling of events in Elvis and Me, too, we'll talk about it more. There have been countless people over the years who are diehard fans of Priscilla who maintain that Currie Grant is a liar. And the reason why they maintain this is because Priscilla successfully sued him for defamation in the late 1990s. And I will link a video underneath this one where I talk specifically about that. And yes, on its face, that seems pretty cut and dry. She sued him, she won for defamation, end of story. He's supposedly telling fabricated lies about her as per the verdict of the defamation suit. But it's extremely important and often overlooked in the history of this entire situation was that there was a legal agreement that was unearthed in the 2000s by an Elvis biographer named Alana Nash, who discovered that in this legal agreement between Currie Grant and Pricilla Presley, after she won that defamation lawsuit, that they were both forbidden to speak about each other in a public arena at all. She could not say certain things about him, and he could not say certain things about her, which is all highly unusual, especially if someone wins a case of defamation. I mean, not so highly unusual in the fact that there was a legal agreement after the verdict, but the circumstances of that agreement were very, very suspect. I'll link that video if you want to know more about it. Getting very interesting, I have to say. And just my thought coming away from all of this as we get more and more into Priscilla's mindset and her insistence on crafting a certain narrative and dying on the hill of that narrative, it becomes increasingly clear to me that there's something going on with that woman, in the sense that I believe, in my personal opinion, that she is very scared to show the real Pricilla for whatever reason. And I'm not exactly sure why. I really do feel that if she would open up more and tell more about her circumstances and how she, lived her life, how everything unfolded, I think people would understand and appreciate and sympathize with her a lot more than they do. Because when your story doesn't stand up to scrutiny, especially when you've got an author who was never sued, whose publishing company was never sued, who's, vetting this story, interviewing 300 some odd people, and when you're just going to die on your hill of your narrative, when all this is flying in the face of that, it's just very, very sad. So I know this was a little bit of a longer one. Thank you for joining me. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not. Get going on the playlist of Child Bride if you have not watched any of the past videos. It's a really, really good story. If you want to get in from the very beginning, I would encourage you to do that. More episodes and chapters to come. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I will speak to you very, very soon. Bye.